in about 5 seconds, so
You're gonna talk?
I will talk.
Okay.
Okay, all right. Well, we're now live. So this is Ben Clifton. I know my name says Eternal Impact, but I'm really Ben Clifton, and I'm here at Eternal Impact's epicenter, where we're hosting our June Portland Reasons to Believe chapter meeting. And once again, we're super honored to have Dr. Fuz Rana join us for this meeting. We're kind of doing a hybrid where we have a few people that we can safely welcome in person, but the majority of people are online, either via Zoom or via our live stream on Facebook. So I want to turn it over fairly quickly to Belinda, and she'll go ahead and introduce our guest, and then we'll take it from there.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our live presentation here with Reasons to Believe, where science and faith converge. So Reasons to Believe's mission is to spread the Christian gospel by demonstrating that reason and scientific research consistently support rather than erode confidence in the truth of the Bible and faith in the personal, transcendent God revealed in both scripture and nature. So we're honored, our Portland chapter is honored to host Dr. Fuz Rana. He's the Vice President of Research and Apologetics at Reasons to Believe. Dr. Rana attended West Virginia State College and then Ohio University, where he earned a PhD in chemistry. His postdoctoral work was conducted at the universities of Virginia and Georgia. Dr. Rana worked for 7 years as a senior scientist in research and development at a Fortune 500 company before joining Reasons to Believe. He is the author of multiple articles and books, including Who Was Adam? A Creation Model Approach to the Origin of Humanity, which was updated after 10 years, and it was published in 2015. So we welcome Dr. Rana.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to be part of your chapter meeting. And I'm really excited that you guys are spending some time working through issues related to the historical Adam, both from a biblical as well as from a scientific perspective. And I can't think of really a more important topic for us to wrestle through these days for a number of reasons, both what's happening within our culture, but also because of what's happening within the church, particularly in the arena of the science-faith conversation. And I, again, am grateful that I could have this opportunity to spend time with you. It would be fun to be able to hang out in person, but unfortunately, circumstances are such that that's not realistic in the near future, at least. But I think, it's amazing what technology affords us the capability of doing. And I can't imagine going through this COVID-19 pandemic without having the technology that we do have that's allowed us to maintain connections with one another. So I think we all are really grateful for what technology has, again, meant to us as individuals and as the church, and then even as our culture at large. And I also want to make sure that before I get too deep into the evening, that I take a moment to just say welcome and thank you on behalf of everybody at Reasons to Believe. We just really deeply appreciate all of our chapters and all the people that volunteer with our ministry. It means a lot to us that there are people that are willing to invest time and resources in what we're doing as a ministry, willing to partner with us, to align with us. We appreciate the fact that you guys are willing to be our spokespeople and our representatives in the Portland area. That means a lot to us. We're grateful that you really take seriously the idea of investing time and energy and effort into growing deeper in the science faith dialogue. with an eye towards not only strengthening your faith, but really using what you've learned to help other people, both in the church and outside the church, handle science faith issues, which many times can keep people from really growing as Christians and can keep people away from the faith as non-believers. So thanks a lot for your partnership with us. We really, really, again, appreciate that. As mentioned this evening, we're going to be taking a look at some of the scientific evidence for the traditional biblical view of human origins, and namely the idea that human beings are made in God's image. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here to get us going this evening. And what I'm going to be doing tonight is presenting a portion of a talk that I gave at the RTB offices in early January. And that seems like a lifetime ago when we were living in a completely different world. But in early January, we hosted a human origins workshop at the RTB campus. And this was in collaboration with another organization called Peaceful Science, which is headed up by Josh Swamidas, who is a friendly critic of Reasons to Believe, of our ministry. And we do actually view Josh as a partner in the gospel. But what we did at that workshop is invited Josh to join us, and then both he and I presented our particular perspectives on the question of human origins, where Josh presented his model for the genealogical Adam. I presented the RTB human origins model. And then after our presentations, we invited some friendly critics, again, scholars in biblical studies, theology, and in science to engage each of our presentations respectively. And that is actually now available. I think the recordings are on Vimeo, but they're now publicly available. So if you're interested in watching about a 7-8 hour workshop on human origins, you can most definitely do that. But this is part of actually our strategic plan at Reasons to Believe, is to have workshops like this, with the idea that these workshops are really going to be vital for our mission, because the idea behind the workshops is to really subject our creation model in a broad sense to peer review, and to also, identify where our model is strong, where our model has weaknesses, where our model is going to be viewed as being credible by the scientific community, where it's going to be viewed as lacking, and then also what do we need to do to expand our model, to extend our model. And so these workshops are going to be really critical. And the thought is that the best way to do this peer review is to really invite people both in and outside the church to engage our model, with the idea that we really want to be open to that input and be willing to revise our model with an eye towards, again, presenting the best case we can for the Christian faith to a culture that is increasingly secular and increasingly scientifically minded. And we're hoping to continue doing these workshops, again, as part of our strategic plan. In an ideal world, we would do a couple of these workshops a year. It turned out to be a lot more work than we thought to do even the first workshop. So right now we're looking at the modest goal of doing another one in the next year. This one is going to be headed up by Jeff Zwirink and I, at least as organizers, and it's going to be on artificial intelligence and human exceptionalism. And we likely will partner again with Peaceful Science, or at least that's what we would like to do for this next workshop, because again, this idea of human exceptionalism is again very much connected to not only our human origins model, but also in my book, Humans 2.0, we began to explore the impact that technology and things like the transhumanism movement would have on the case for human exceptionalism. And so Jeff is going to extend some of that thinking by specifically focusing on AI and what do developments in AI tell us about, again, our nature as human beings. So anyway, so what I'm going to present tonight is really an abridged version of the talk that I gave at the Human Origins workshop. I'm going to edit out some content, not a lot, but some of the content, just because of time considerations. This was about an hour and 15-minute presentation at the workshop, so we'll trim it back just a little bit. But after I do the presentation, I would definitely love to turn the floor open to discussion and questions. So we definitely can do that. So my task at the workshop and what I'm going to do this evening is essentially present the RTB Human Origins model and then provide a scientific defense for that model, explain why I think that model has scientific integrity. And of course, the model that we espouse at Reasons to Believe is a traditional biblical model for human origins. It's a traditional historical model that has these key elements which I think make it a traditional view of human origins, namely that we would view the origin of humanity as the product of God's direct and personal intervention as a creator to bring about the origin of humanity. In other words, we don't see humanity having an evolutionary history, but rather we see humanity having an origin through, again, God's fiat creation. That Adam and Eve were actually real individuals. They weren't mythical, but they were real individuals, and that they weren't representatives, but rather a primordial pair. That were the first human beings that were the progenitors of all humanity, and that Adam and Eve, as well as all of their descendants, stand apart from every other creature that God has made, in that we uniquely bear God's image. And that's what we're going to be primarily defending tonight. When it comes to our human origins model, one of the first things that we must do, particularly when we're engaging people with a strong scientific background who are influenced by the mainstream views in the scientific community, is that we have to essentially account for what many people see to be the unequivocal, unassailable, compelling evidence for human evolution, which is specifically the hominin fossil record and the fact that human beings have shared biological features with not only the hominins, but other creatures like the great apes. And these shared features include not only anatomical features, but also genetic features. And we now have the incredible, we're now in a really incredible point in human history, where not only do we have a high quality set of genome sequences for modern humans, but we have high quality genome sequences for Neanderthals, for Denisovans. We have some DNA data from Homo heidelbergensis. And we also have genomes for the great apes, chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, and gorillas. And this affords us the opportunity to do some very sophisticated work in comparative genomics. And people argue that these shared biological features reflect essentially an evolutionary history that humanity shares with the great apes and with the hominins. And so what do we do with this evidence? And we at Reasons to Believe recognize that the hominin fossil record is a real sampling of the hominin natural history, but that we would argue that the hominins were not our evolutionary predecessors, but rather creatures that God created like he created human beings that existed for a period of time and then went extinct. These creatures, like all mammals, had intelligence and emotional capability, but that they lacked something very important, and that would be the image of God. And so we think of these hominins in the same vein that we would think of chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas. Fascinating creatures, to be certain, that do have biological similarities to us as human beings, but also are fundamentally distinct in terms of cognitive abilities. We think of the hominins in that same vein, though we would argue that these hominins, in some instances, at least for some hominins, were more sophisticated than the chimpanzees and the bonobos. Now, this idea of viewing of the hominins in this way is not an ad hoc response to the scientific evidence, but rather it's an idea that flows out of Scripture itself. So, for example, if you look at Genesis 1, or even if we look at Psalm 104 as creation passages, what is clearly emphasized is that God is creating in stages, that at different epochs in the Earth's history and life's history, God is creating different life forms, and that there's a purposeful progression to God's work as creator. And so therefore, it's reasonable, I think, to look at the fossil record in general, but specifically the hominin fossil record in those terms, as reflecting a purposeful progression in terms of God's creative work. But also it's an idea that, believe it or not, has precedence in the history of science. So for example, the famous Swiss geologist, Louis Agassiz, actually, who was a devout Christian, interpreted the fossil record in the same way that we do, in which he argued that the history of life reflects a progressive series of creation events with biological groups originating from the mind of God. So the point here is that, again, we're not making an ad hoc maneuver to accommodate scientific data, but this idea is actually part of the construct of science and flows out of the biblical text. Likewise, when it comes to the shared biological features, we would actually argue that, again, a reading of the biblical text implies that human beings should share biological similarities with other creatures. So, for example, Genesis 2:7 and Genesis 2:19 teach us that both Adam, as well as the animals, the beasts of the field, the birds in the air, were made from the dust of the earth. And so this implies that we were made out of the same stuff as the animals, that we would be made out of, by implication, the same kind of designs. And what distinguishes us is that we receive the divine breath, and that the animals do not. And so the point being this, that again, we would expect biblically to see shared biological features between humans and other creatures. So it's an idea that, again, likewise flows from the biblical text, but also, again, there's historical precedent for viewing shared features as reflecting common design as opposed to common descent. Richard Owen, famous biologist prior to Darwin, was one of the scientists who articulated the concepts of homology, interpreted homologous features or shared biological features as reflecting an archetypical design that exists in the mind of a creator that is then functionally manifested in the created order. And Owen proposed in a series of lectures to the Royal Society what he called the vertebrate archetype. And for Owen, the archetype, again, was this ideal that existed in the mind of a creator that was then functionally manifested in the created order in a variety of different variants. And that for Owen, he saw the archetype as the ultimate expression of God's ingenuity, the ultimate expression of teleology and design. In Owen's day, there was an interesting debate going on among biologists, and biology prior to Darwin was deeply teleological. This debate centered around the question, what is the organizing principle in biology? Is it function, or is it form? And Owen sought to unite those two schools of thought. And he argued that with the archetype, you have this again, core design that was so robust that it could actually be varied in such a way to produce these incredibly elegant functional systems that different organisms possessed. And so the idea that you could attain this high level of functionality by varying this, this archetypical design to Owen was again the quintessential example of design. But again, what Owen is looking at here is that these shared features reflect shared designs. And it was only later that Darwin co-opts the idea of the archetype and evolutionizes it by converting it into a hypothetical common ancestor, that this idea of shared features becomes entrenched in the evolutionary framework. So the point here is that our creation model can actually accommodate the data that many people would point to as being, again, unequivocal evidence for human evolution. And what we are seeing here is a consequence of what philosophers of science would call the underdetermination problem. That is, data always underdetermines theories, which means, in a nutshell, that you can have two radically different theories that can equally well accommodate the same set of data. And so we would argue that our creation model approach can accommodate the data that people, again, think is being the evidence that demands an evolutionary interpretation, that our creation model can accommodate that data. Now, when it comes to investigating the origin of humanity, this is also the opportunity for us to evaluate our creation model approach. And typically, when you look at the origin of humanity, there are three fundamentally important and distinct sets of data. The archaeological record, which reflects essentially behavioral capacities of the hominins and of modern humans. The fossil record, which of course gives us a record of an anatomical and morphological features. And then recently, it's molecular anthropology and comparative genomics. And what I see happening today, particularly among evangelical scholars, is that there is a very strong emphasis on the results from molecular anthropology and comparative genomics, almost to the exclusion of any discussion of the fossil record or what the archaeological record is telling us. I see this also happening within physical anthropology as well, within those people who are working on the science of human origins, where again, it almost is as if there's an overemphasis on the genetic data to the exclusion again of the fossil record and the archaeological record. But I see this happening among evangelicals to a much, much greater degree. And I think this is really unfortunate because for me, molecular anthropology and comparative genomics is a data set we definitely want to pay attention to, but much of the insight that we derive from these areas is dependent upon rather sophisticated and complex mathematical modeling, where the results that we're debating are the results of, again, modeling studies, trying to account for patterns that we see in comparative genomics and in the data from molecular anthropology. On the other hand, the fossil record and the archaeological record are much more direct pieces of data, or sets of data that we can actually evaluate, again, much more directly. So it's a cleaner perspective, I think, on the origin of humanity. And both the archaeological record and the fossil record actually give us information that helps us to adjudicate different models and different approaches that evangelical scholars are pursuing when it comes to trying to make sense of human origins. So for example, one of the ideas that is connected to the genealogical Adam approach of Josh Swamidass is that maybe Adam and Eve actually were in the Neolithic time frame, not the Paleolithic time frame, that it was a recent Adam and Eve. And that as a result of that, there would have been humans prior to the existence of Adam and Eve, and then also humans that would be contemporary with Adam and Eve that were quote unquote outside the garden. Or you see people like William Lane Craig, who was one of the panelists who critiqued my presentation, arguing that actually Adam should go back all the way to Homo heidelbergensis, to maybe even 500,000 years ago, where Neanderthals and Homo heidelbergensis would be part of the descendants of Adam and Eve. Or people like Ann Gager, connected with the Discovery Institute arguing that maybe Homo erectus was Adam. And so the way in which you adjudicate these models is not with comparative genomics or molecular anthropology, it's actually with the archaeological record and the fossil record. And so tonight I'm going to focus my attention on these two data sets, primarily giving most of the emphasis tonight on the archaeological record. Because again, I think these are neglected areas. And one of the points that I tried to make forcefully in the workshop is that we have to incorporate all of the data sets into a coherent framework when we're developing human origins models. Now, the archaeological record is a very powerful tool to help us essentially demonstrate cognitive capabilities of the hominins and of modern humans. This is important because when we start talking about cognitive abilities and the idea that, or at least the question, are human beings unique? Are we exceptional compared to the hominins, compared to the great apes? This idea of the question related to human exceptionality gets to the idea that human beings are unique in some capacity in that we are image bearers. And so this idea of the image of God is connected to the idea of human exceptionalism, and the idea of human exceptionalism can be evaluated or assessed from the archaeological record and indirectly from the fossil record. Now, when it comes to the image of God, as I'm sure Ken Samples shared with you, that there are three views that are in play today among conservative and evangelical scholars. The resemblance view, the representative view, and the relational view. The resemblance view is the view that the image of God refers to certain capabilities or capacities that we have as human beings that distinguish us from other creatures, and that these would be capacities that also we share with the Creator as well, to a limited degree, to be certain, and imperfectly. But it's because we possess these qualities that we're able to enter into a relationship with God, that we're able to carry out the responsibility that God has given to us as having authority over the creation and as being stewards over the creation, because we bear the image of God. This was the historical perspective on the image of God. Also, it's a perspective that gains a strong biblical support from the writings of Paul. There are two epistles, I think it's Colossians and in Ephesians, where Paul actually defines the image of God, and he defines the image of God as actually referring to attributes that we have as human beings. Now, today it's more popular for evangelical scholars to argue for the representative view or the relational view. And these are ideas that derive from the Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 creation accounts, where they would say that really the image of God is nothing to do with our capability, but rather our functional responsibility within the creation. That again, we're to be God's vice regents here on earth, that we're to be stewards of the planet. Or the relational view is that the image of God refers to our relational status with the Creator. These views do have biblical support, but again, I think the strongest biblical support is for the resemblance view. It's the historical view. And by the way, the resemblance view actually subsumes both the representative view and the relational view. These three views are not mutually exclusive, in other words. And so at RTB, we take the resemblance view, and that we would argue that as part of our shared attributes with the Creator, there are different facets of the image of God. We have an intellectual capacity, that is, we can represent the world. Sorry, that we have a technical inventiveness, that we have a creativity, a capacity for rational thought and deliberation, that we have a moral component, and that we understand right and wrong, and that we have a sense of justice. We have a spiritual component that recognizes the transcendent and desires to connect to it, that we are relational creatures, that we desire to relate to the transcendent, to relate to the Creator, but also have a capacity to relate to other people. And what's intriguing to me is that these different elements of the image of God in a resemblance view model are precisely the same kind of attributes that we see that many scholars think sets us apart as human beings, that makes us exceptional as human beings. Something that's happening that's very interesting in anthropology is that this idea of human exceptionalism is now gaining a strong foothold and is gaining actually credibility and momentum. There's a growing number of anthropologists and evolutionary psychologists that would actually argue that human beings really do stand apart from other creatures, that we really are exceptional. And this is a radical maneuver on the part of these scientists, because for about 150 plus years, the science of human origins has been shaped by Darwin's idea that human beings only differ in degree, not kind, from other creatures, that we're not fundamentally different than other creatures, we only differ in degree. And therefore, human beings are not exceptional in any sense, that the antecedents to those behaviors that we think make us exceptional actually exist within the great apes or within the hominins. But there's, again, a departure from this view, and this where people argue that we are exceptional, and they would maintain that what makes us exceptional is our capacity for symbolism, our open-ended generative capacity, that is our ability to manipulate those symbols, our theory of mind, that we recognize that people have others have minds like us, and that we desire to connect our minds together, and we can do so through a very elaborate, sophisticated, hierarchical social structure. And so when you think about these qualities, these are essentially scientific descriptors of what we would think the image of God to be in a resemblance view. And so I see the idea of human exceptionalism being deeply intertwined with the image of God. And a case for human exceptionalism is a case for the image of God. Now, this is a place where William Lane Craig and I had really strong agreement, is that we both held to a resemblance view. Sometimes you'll hear the resemblance view called a structuralist view, and then sometimes you'll hear the representative view called a functional view. And so we both agree that it's a resemblance view or a structuralist view, and we also both agree that the archaeological record is going to be a very valuable way to determine who or what possesses the image of God, and when does the image of God appear, what is the mode and the tempo for the appearance of the image of God, with the idea that the image of God is going to be reflected in the type of behavior that we are capable of, and that behavior reflects our cognitive ability, and that's going to in turn be reflected in the types of artifacts that we produce, where the archaeological record becomes a proxy for, again, the image of God. And what we're looking for specifically is evidence for symbolism, because I believe that symbolism is probably the most critical or the most important marker in the archaeological record for the image of God. And this cartoon that I've taken from Who Was Adam shows a broad overview of the archaeological record. And we see, even with a very broad overview, that the archaeological record does seem to reinforce the idea that human beings do stand apart from other creatures. Now, when it comes to the archaeological record, what many times the focus is on the toolkit or the technology produced by hominins. And so there's a temptation, I think, to look at tool usage as a marker for the image of God and as a marker for cognitive ability. And again, I would take a differing perspective, that what we really want to focus on is symbolism, not tool usage. Now, traditionally, the very first stone tool makers were considered to be Homo habilis, or the habilines. And this tool usage appears at about 2.2 million years ago, and is sometimes referred to as the Mode 1 technology or the Oldowan technology. And this consisted of essentially the production of stone flakes that were used as expedient tools that were then discarded after they were utilized. These tools were not carried with them for all intents and purposes by the Habilines, where they would make these stone flakes by hitting a core stone with a hammer stone, again producing the flakes. This technology persists for a few 100,000 years and then is replaced when Homo ergaster appears on the scene at about 1.8 million years ago, where we see associated with the erectines and some of the early archaic Homo sapiens, like Homo heidelbergensis, Homo ancestor, Homo heidelbergensis, essentially what would be known as the Acheulean technology or the Mode 2 technology, which is a step change in increase in sophistication compared to the older one technology, but is still, again, not that impressive necessarily. This is an example of the types of tools that would be associated with the Acheulean technology, where not only were flakes produced as tools, but also the core stones were shaped into a variety of different shapes like pickaxes and hand axes and things like that, that were then used for more specialized purposes. This technology persists for about 1 million years. And then with the appearance of Neanderthals, we see a distinct type of technology called the Mousterian technology. That is a step change in sophistication compared to what we see with the Acheulean technology. And this is a technology associated exclusively with modern humans. Sorry, check that, with Neanderthals. Then when modern humans appear on the scene, we see what is referred to by many people as the sociocultural Big Bang, where we see an explosive appearance of sophistication in the toolkits. And we also see the very first clear, unequivocal evidence for musical expression, for art. And so there's something dramatic happening when modern humans appear on the scene that seemingly sets us apart from the other hominins. Now, it is possible that if you're looking at the fossil record that you, sorry, check that, when you're looking at it is possible if you're looking at the archaeological record, in spite of the fact that there seems to be this dramatic change in the features of the archaeological record when modern humans appear on the scene, it is possible to view this in evolutionary terms, where you could argue, well, it does look like there is this gradual increase in the sophistication of the tools that are used by these different hominins, where there may be this long leg, but there is a point where it looks like things suddenly take off and explode. But many people see an evolutionary trajectory when they look at the archaeological record. And I would agree that that's a valid way to look at it. However, these comparisons are all involving a single anchor point. And the question becomes, well, what happens if we add a second anchor point to our comparisons? And a second anchor point that we can add that is actually germane is the behavior of chimpanzees and bonobos. In the last decade or so, there's been some rather remarkable work done by primatologists observing the behavior of chimps in the wild as well as in captivity. And we're discovering that chimpanzees do some rather remarkable things. For example, people have observed chimpanzees manufacturing spears in the wild, where it's a 6-step manufacturing process where they'll take a tree branch and strip it and then prepare it to use as a spear that they will actually hunt with. Chimps will make rather clever tools to extract termites from their nest, or tools that they will develop to actually fish with. They make stone tools that they use it to open up nuts, for example. In fact, there are some actually chimpanzee archaeological sites that show stone tool usage that goes back several 1,000 years that people have documented and described. We also see, that chimps have been observed occupying caves in response to harsh weather conditions. They fabricate beds from tree branches where they will take these tree branches and that they will select certain trees to use to construct their beds, where the tree branches have certain tensile properties as well as insect repellent properties. And then they'll put these beds, they fabricate in particular locations in trees that allow them easy escape in case a predator comes along. They mourn the dead. They're dead. They make use of plants for medicinal purposes. This is incredible behavior, to be certain. And this reflects, again, the fact that these creatures have an emotional capacity and an intellectual capacity, but I don't think anybody would confuse a chimpanzee or a bonobo with a modern human. There's clearly something that distinguishes us from chimps and bonobos. And we would say as Christians, this is the image of God. And so, but yet this is the same kind of behavior that we see for the habilines and for the erectines. And so what this means is that when we add the second anchor point to the comparison, suddenly what we see is that the habilines and the erectines cluster in terms of their behavior with the chimpanzees and bonobos, really setting human beings dramatically apart from these three groups. And we're going to put a stick in Neanderthals for a few minutes, and we'll deal with Neanderthals in a minute. But what this does is really reinforces the idea that we are different from the chimps, that we are different from at least the erectines and the habilines in a way that's consistent with the predictions of our human origins model. And this is actually something that is not just simply an observation that I've made, but also this is an observation that has been made by anthropologists. So for example, Julio Mercader and collaborators write for PNAS, the full implications of this line of work require a reevaluation of the terms under which we make meaningful comparisons of Oldowan and chimpanzee cultures. The behavior variables documented at Nuolo, which is a chimpanzee archaeological site, indicate that chimpanzees and hominins share cultural attributes, including the transport of stones across the landscape for projected use elsewhere, the optimal combination of raw materials and size, and weight criteria to perform a predicted activity, the reoccupation of focal points, creation of activity areas, the use of locally available resources, and the curation and selection of specific types of stones that are most optimal for specific technological activities. So again, what the archaeological record is showing us is that, again, human beings really do stand apart from at least the habilines and the erectines, and that these creatures are behaving in remarkable ways, but it's qualitatively no different than what we see for chimps and bonobos. Now, the next thing that we want to focus on is what happens when modern humans appear on the scene. As I mentioned, when modern humans appear on the scene, there's a dramatic step change in terms of the sophistication of the toolkits that we're producing. Suddenly we see art, we see musical expression, and this has been historically dubbed the sociocultural Big Bang, where it appears as if out of nowhere, sophisticated behavior shows up without any kind of real evolutionary any kind of evolutionary anticipation of the sociocultural Big Bang. Christopher Stringer and Robin McVie describe the sociocultural Big Bang this way. Before then, Homo sapiens, and what they mean by this is the archaic Homo sapiens, not modern humans, were marking time culturally. For millennia upon millennia, they've been churning out the same forms as stone utensils. About 40,000 years ago, a perceptible shift in the handiwork took place. Toolkits leapt in sophistication. Signs of the use of ropes, bone spear points, fish hooks, and harpoons emerge, along with the sudden manifestation of sculptures, paintings, and musical instruments. We also find evidence for the first long-distance exchange of stones and beads. It's an extraordinary catalog of achievements that seem to have come from nowhere. And nothing exemplifies the sociocultural Big Bang more so than the art that appears in Europe when modern humans make their way into Europe for the first time. We don't see a gradual evolution of art where it's simple art that then becomes increasingly sophisticated, but we see art that appears in the archaeological record in Europe, virtually out of nowhere, and that art is as sophisticated at its first appearance as art is today. There's no evolution for art. Anthony Sinclair said this: the study of early art has been plagued by our desire to see this essentially human skill in a progressive evolutionary context. Simple artistic expressions should lead to latter, more sophisticated creations. Yet for many outlets of artistic expression, cave paintings, textiles, ceramics, and musical instruments, the evidence increasingly refuses to fit. Instead of a gradual evolution of skills, the first modern humans in Europe were in fact astonishingly precocious artists. So this is again rather remarkable, and yet as intriguing as the sociocultural Big Bang is, this actually created a bit of a problem for the RTB human origins model, because when we first published Who Was Adam, the data seemed to indicate that modern humans appeared at about in the 50 to 75,000 year window of time. But as time went on, it became evident that the appearance of modern humans was actually closer to 150,000 years ago, meaning that there now was a lag between when anatomically modern humans appear and behaviorally modern humans appear. And that lag time of 100,000 years fits very well in an evolutionary context where there was some kind of presumed trigger that suddenly leads to this sociocultural Big Bang. Whereas from a biblical account, you would expect that anatomically and behaviorally modern humans should have an appearance that coincides, that both should appear at the same time. And yet, even from an evolutionary perspective, there was still an enigma associated with the sociocultural Big Bang, because it wasn't clear what that trigger event was, because there is no biological difference between humans that were in Europe at 40,000 years ago and the modern humans that appear at 150,000 years ago. So the question was, what was that biological trigger? And now it turns out that in recent years, there have been very important advances in archaeology that essentially resolve this dilemma for the RTB human origins model, which actually forces the origin of anatomically and behaviorally modern humans to the same point or the same window of time. And the perhaps the most significant discoveries along these lines are the art that's been discovered in caves in Southeast Asia. There's a number of cave sites throughout Southeast Asia that have now have been discovered in which there is art on the cave walls. And this art is essentially identical to the cave art that you see in Europe. And in fact, some of this art actually dates to be older than the cave art that we see in Europe. For example, just recently, a team discovered in a cave site in Sulawesi, which is one of the islands of Indonesia, a mural on the wall that was depicting a hunt. And that mural involved the depiction of what are called theranthropes, which are these human-animal hybrids that are depicted, and that people believe that these theranthropes are referring to kind of these spirit helpers that would have assisted humans in the hunt. That is, that this was depicting a mythology and a sense of an imaginary world that not only relies on a capacity for symbolism, but also a capacity for open-ended generative manipulation of those symbols, which allows for the construction of story or myth. And so the archaeologists argue that this is the oldest documented story that has ever been discovered or has been discovered to this point in time. But again, this idea of these theranthropes is significant because it says that these artists were not only sophisticated in their capacity for symbolism, but they were sophisticated in terms of their ability to manipulate those symbols, and that they had a sense of the transcendent, a sense of the imaginary world. And this is interesting because we also see in Europe, dated at 38,000 years in age, a statue of the Lion Man, the Lowenmensch statue, which is a depiction of a human lion hybrid. Again, this is a theranthrope, which suggests that both the humans in Europe and in Asia that were making this art, again, were very sophisticated in how they viewed the world, where they saw the world as really being complex, comprised of both a physical and a spiritual or an immaterial realm. But it also means that this capacity for art must have been with humans as they began to migrate around the world. That, in other words, you cannot argue that the art in Europe reflected humans migrating into Europe and then some kind of trigger event sets off the sociocultural Big Bang, and then through cultural diffusion, artistic expression spreads throughout the rest of the world. Rather, it's saying that humans already possessed inherently this capacity for art before we even began to migrate around the world. And this is how Christopher Stringer describes this. It's a really important find, the archaeological sites in Asia. It enables us to get away from this Eurocentric view of a creative explosion that was special to Europe and did not develop in other parts of the world until much later. The basis for this art was there about 60,000 years ago. It may have even been there in Africa before 60,000 years ago, and it spread with modern humans. Couple this insight with the discovery of symbolic artifacts throughout caves in the coastal area of South Africa, which date as far back as 80,000 years ago, now pushes the origin of symbolism again closer and closer to the appearance of anatomically modern humans. And in fact, just recently in a cave in South Africa, a team of archaeologists discovered the oldest evidence for an abstract drawing that dates at 78,000 years, which again is pushing artistic expression back to, again, 78,000 years ago, which is significant. We also see some flickering of evidence for symbolism in cave sites in Israel and Algeria, where you could argue that symbolism goes back as far as 100 to 135,000 years ago, and again is associated with modern human remains in these sites. And then Shigeru Miyagawa, a Japanese paleolinguist at MIT, actually argues that artistic expression goes back even earlier than 100,000 years ago. And his argument rests on the fact that the San people were producing rock art as early as 70,000 years ago, and that rock art again has the same character as the art that we see in Europe and in Asia. And so therefore, this artistic expression must have actually predated the time in which the San diverge from the modern human lineage. The San are one of the oldest people groups to diverge from kind of the modern human phylogenetic tree. And that time of divergence was somewhere between 108 and 157,000 years ago. So that means that, again, the ability for artistic expression must have predated that time of divergence. This is pushing the origin of artistic expression and symbolism back towards, again, the time where we think modern humans would have appeared. Now, one of the capacities that we have that reflects in a quintessential way our ability for symbolism and open-ended generative capacity is our ability for language. And language is something that you cannot evaluate from the archaeological record or the fossil record. It's really not possible to do that. So what you have to do, again, is use something as a stand-in for language. And that stand-in actually would be artistic expression. And so really, if you're saying artistic expression and symbolism go back to the time where modern humans appear, this actually implies that language appears coincidentally with the appearance of modern humans. Now, even though people can't assess the origin of language from the archaeological record, people have actually tried to account for the origin of language through evolutionary processes, through evolutionary mechanisms. And one of the frustrating things for people working in this area is that we cannot come up with a good evolutionary model to account for the origin of language. This is one of the serious problems confronting the evolutionary paradigm. Chris Knight says this: language evolved in no other species than humans, suggesting a deep-going obstacle to its evolution. One possibility is that language simply cannot evolve in a Darwinian world, that is, in a world based ultimately on competition and conflict. The underlying problem may be that the communicative use of language presupposes anomalously high levels of mutual cooperation and trust, levels beyond anything which current Darwinian theory can explain. And so this is significant because it means that from an evolutionary perspective, our capacity for symbolism simply lacks, again, a robust explanation. It is enigmatic for the evolutionary paradigm. Also enigmatic for the evolutionary paradigm is something else that has recently been recognized by paleolinguists, and that is that instead of language appearing as a proto-language that then becomes a simple language and then evolves into more complex language, it looks as if language emerges suddenly, coincides with the origin of modern humans. It seems to be unique to modern humans, and that the very first language was as syntactically as complex as modern day language. That is, you could almost argue that it looks as if language, and hence symbolism, those qualities that make us exceptional, those qualities that we would connect with the image of God, seem to appear virtually out of nowhere. It looks to me like this is a creation event. This is what Miyazawa says. The hierarchical complexity found in present-day language is likely to have been present in human language since its emergence. Noam Chomsky and Ian Tattersall argue that it looks as if the language faculty in humans was instantiated all at once in a fell swoop in human beings. This is what they say. By this reckoning, the language faculty is an extremely recent acquisition in our lineage, and it was acquired not in the context of slow, gradual modification of pre-existing systems under natural selection, but in a single rapid emergent event that built upon those prior systems but was not predicted by them. The relatively sudden origin of language poses difficulties that may be called Darwin's problem. And so what we see here is something really significant, and that is that when anatomically modern humans appear on the scene, we see the appearance of symbolism and open-ended generative capacity, and that this again appears suddenly out of nowhere, and trying to explain the origin of symbolic capability is a challenge for the evolutionary paradigm. So it looks as if we have evidence for not only human exceptionalism, at least with respect to humans being compared to chimpanzees, the habilines, and the erectines, but that what makes us exceptional seems to show up out of nowhere. It looks as if it's a creation event. Now, the one thing that we need to address, though, is the question of Neanderthals, because I put a pin in Neanderthals, and now it's time to take out that pin, because the whole idea of human exceptionalism potentially unravels in light of the claim that Neanderthals too were making art. They made jewelry, they made music, they possessed language, they buried their dead ritually, they mastered fire. These are all claims that you can find in the scientific literature. And this means that Neanderthals must have been like us too, that the Neanderthals were exceptional like us too. And that means that either this exceptional nature arises in Homo heidelbergensis, which is believed to be the shared evolutionary ancestor of humans and Neanderthals, or that Neanderthals independently acquired a capacity for symbolism. Either way, it means that it undermines the notion that human beings, again, are exceptional, and that there is this sudden appearance of our symbolic capabilities. So what do we do with these claims? Well, the point I would like to make is this, is that even though these claims are in the scientific literature, not a single one of these claims withstands ongoing scientific scrutiny. Almost every one of, in fact, every one of these claims has basically been overturned. Ian Tattersall and Jeffrey Schwartz write Among Neanderthals, all claimed instances of early symbolism are strongly disputed, and for Homo erectus, there are no specific claims of this kind at all. Now, this was written in 2009, but this assertion on the part of Schwartz and Tattersall still stands even today, 11 years later. And I don't have time to go through every one of those instances and explain why these are not valid scientific claims. I discuss some of this work in the updated edition of Who Was Adam, and I also discuss some of these more recent studies in my blog called The Cell's Design, where I frequently write about claims about Neanderthal exceptionalism. But we can illustrate the problems confronting these claims by looking at the claim that Neanderthals made music, that they produced musical instruments. And this is a picture of what's called a bone flute that is formed from a hollowed out cave bear femur, where it looks as if there are two holes that are punched in it. Now, these bone flutes are fairly prominent in the archaeological record, associated actually with modern humans. But there are a couple of Neanderthal sites that show these bone flutes. And on the basis of these a couple of sites, people have claimed that Neanderthals were able to make musical instruments, that they had musical capabilities, that is, they possessed the capacity for symbolism, that this is not unique to human beings. Problem is that there was a follow-up study done where researchers very carefully examined the punctures using microscopic techniques and determined that those puncture marks were not made by a tool or by hominin activity, but by the scavenging activity of hyenas, specifically the spotted hyenas, that would go into these caves and would essentially chew up cave bear remains, trying to get at the marrow inside the cave bear femur. And biting into these bones, occasionally they would puncture holes in them. And so these artificially, or artifactually, I should say, look like they are flutes, but in fact, they are essentially the remains of scavenging activity. And compare this bone flute, quote unquote, with the oldest known musical instrument, which is a flute made out of ivory that dates at 38,000 years, found in a cave in Germany. Ivory would have been the best material that would have been available to these humans. This was made out of solid material that had to be formed or manufactured in pieces that were then very carefully fitted together to produce this musical instrument. And you can actually see those juncture points if you look at that bone flute carefully. And this again is capable of playing complex melodies and would require a sophisticated manufacturing process. And so in other words, this idea that Neanderthals made music is a claim that is still out there, that I hear raised all the time, but in fact has been, I think, completely undermined by subsequent studies. Schwartz and Tattersall basically argue that human beings are exceptional compared to Neanderthals, that human beings alone, they write, it seems, mentally dissect the world into a multitude of discrete symbols and combine and recombine those symbols in their minds to produce hypotheses of alternative possibilities. Symbolic and non-symbolic cognitive states are clearly separated by a qualitative gulf. The former is not simply an extension of the latter, a little bit more of the same. And so even though, again, Neanderthals are creating a technology called the Mousterian technology that is more sophisticated than that of the Erectines and the Habilines, what they are doing is still, again, has a far separation from what modern humans are doing, and that Neanderthals essentially lacked symbolism, that they were not exceptional like us. For Tattersall and Schwartz, the clincher for why they think human beings uniquely possess language and why Neanderthals did not has to do with the trajectory of Neanderthal technology. Neanderthals are on Earth longer than we were on Earth, almost 250,000 years. And Uh, Throughout the duration of that time, their technology remained essentially static. Modern humans appear on the scene in a window of time much smaller than Neanderthals' existence. We went from having primitive technology, though more sophisticated even at its onset than that of Neanderthals. It was still primitive technology that then exploded in really a few millennia to produce essentially the capacity now to put people on the moon, or to use techniques like CRISPR gene editing to take control of the evolution of animal life and even human life here on Earth. This is what Tattersall and Schwartz write. Our species was born in the technologically archaic context, and significantly, the tempo of change only began picking up after the point at which symbolic objects appeared. Evidently, a new potential for symbolic thought was born with our anatomically distinct species, but it was only expressed after a necessary cultural stimulus had exerted itself. This stimulus was most plausibly the appearance of language. Then, within a remarkably short space of time, art was invented, cities were born, and people had reached the moon. So again, this is highlighting the fact that we really are exceptional. Now, one other thing I want to talk about, and then we will bring things to a close, and that's this, that we also can learn quite a bit about the origin of humanity by looking at the fossil record. And what we want to focus on in the fossil record are characteristics that would be markers for the appearance of modern humans. And at the same time, those characteristics that would distinguish us from the other hominins. And indeed, we see these anatomical distinctives most prominently when we compare the skulls of modern humans with the skulls of the hominins. For example, when we look at the modern human skull versus the Neanderthal skull, the Neanderthal skull was elongated. There was an occipital bun at the base of the skull. There's a prominent brow ridge, and the chin is jutting outward. With modern humans, the skull is globular. Our skull is really bizarre compared to the other hominins. It stands apart. We have no brow ridge. We have no occipital bun. Our chin is retracted. And so we actually are exceptional in terms of our anatomical features, particularly our skull shape. And this difference is emphasized in a study done a number of years ago, where researchers reconstructed the brains of Neanderthals and of archaic Homo sapiens, as well as the Homo erectus, or the erectines, and compared it with modern humans. And what they saw is that Homo erectus and the archaic Homo sapiens had the same kind of brain shape as Neanderthals. The only difference was that the Neanderthal brain was larger. Modern humans, when we appear on the scene, have a very different kind of brain shape. And our brain shape actually has a much more enlarged parietal lobe and enlarged cerebral areas. And that these enlarged areas are the parts of the brain that actually are responsible for religious experience, for our sense of self and identity, for language, and for math abilities, mathematical processing. That is, our brain seems to be constructed in such a way to support symbolic activity, to support open-ended generative capacity, to support theory of mind, whereas the brain structure of Neanderthals and the archaic Homo sapiens, as well as Homo erectus, was fundamentally different. We would not expect Neanderthals to have the ability for symbolism based on the differences in their brain shapes compared to our brain shape. And so the question then becomes, well, when does this when does this suite of anatomical features appear in the fossil record? And we have these hominins that are called near anatomically modern humans, like the Homo kabesh, or the Kafsa and the skull finds in Israel, or the Rhodesian man, or Homo sapiens idautu. that date at about 200,000 years in age. Well, it turns out that these particular hominins actually have, while they have a retracted chin, still have an elongated skull. And it's not until about 130,000 years ago that the globular brain shape as well as the retracted chin shows up. And this is the definitive point in which modern humans appear. And so this is a principal component analysis done by a study looking at the skull anatomy of Homo erectus, Neanderthals, and number one would be the near anatomically modern humans. Number two would be a group of fossil finds that date between 100 and 130,000 years ago. And then group three would be modern humans that dated about 40,000 years ago. And you see that groups 2 and 3 kind of cluster together with present day humans, indicating that the modern human skull anatomy shows up at about 130,000 years ago, and that we stand apart from the near anatomically modern humans, Neanderthals, and Homo erectus. Here's another principal component analysis showing, in effect, the same kind of patterns. So what we're saying here is this, that we see anatomically modern humans appearing at the same time that we see the evidence for symbolism appearing in the archaeological record. And this really gives us the window of time where modern humans must have originated. This would give us the window of time in which Adam and Eve would have been created. This would be the time frame for the appearance of modern humans, and hence the creation event. And that we argued then when it comes to the archaeological record, it does look like there is a creation event taking place where out of nowhere, sophisticated behavior shows up all at once and appears to be unique to modern humans. What's also interesting is that this is also the window of time where it looks as if we would place mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam. So there's this remarkable confluence of evidence, I think, that really gives us a time window when modern humans would have appeared. And so in other words, by virtue of the fossil record and the archaeological record, I think you could make a reasoned case that the biblical view for the origin of humanity actually does indeed have credibility, particularly the idea that human beings bear God's image, that we stand apart, and that humanity's origin does involve some kind of creation event because of the inability of the evolutionary paradigm to account for the origin of symbolism, and again, the mode and the tempo for the appearance of symbolic behavior in the archaeological record, where it seems to, again, to show up all at once and be and coincide with the appearance of modern humans. Now, if I have to make a case for the biblical account of human origins in front of a scientific audience on the university campus, I would focus on the archaeological record. One of the things that I think has happened in recent years because of the emergence of biologos as well as the emergence of comparative genomics and molecular anthropology is the question of the origin of humanity. When we look at comparative genomics and molecular anthropology, has become heavily muddled. And so for me, I think this is a data set right now that I'm a little reticent to really engage in terms of using it as a way to make an argument for the biblical account of human origins, if I may be blunt and frank. And the reason why is because there's so much so much confusion going on in this area right now. And in the methods that are being used to characterize the origin of humanity using genetic techniques, in my mind, are methods that I'm not convinced at this point are really well established or credible methods. And one of the things that came out of the workshop was essentially the point made by Josh Swamidas, and that was this, that while comparative genomics and molecular anthropology cannot be used to demonstrate the historicity of Adam and Eve and the idea that Adam and Eve came from a primordial pair, or sorry, that humanity came from a primordial pair, from a single couple, you cannot rule that out either from the data. from comparative genomics and molecular anthropology. And this is really a significant admission, because this is a very different message than what we see from Biologos, who for a decade have claimed, or decade or more have claimed, that there is no way that humanity could have begun with from anything fewer than about 10,000 individuals. And it turns out that what Biologos was doing was claiming that the minimum population size from comparative genomics and molecular anthropology was essentially 10,000. And what Josh was pointing out is that actually these areas are giving us not a minimum population size, but an average population size. And it's an average population for a window of time. And so if you say that the average population size was 10,000 individuals, and that window of time that you're looking at maybe 5,000 years, let's say, for, hypothetically, it means that over the span of 5,000 years, the average population would have been 10,000 individuals. But there could have been points in that window of time where the human population could have dipped down to as low as 2 individuals. And so, so Josh's point is that the science doesn't rule out the historical Adam and Eve. It doesn't affirm it, but it doesn't rule it out. And so to me, that's significant, because it means that the criticism that we received over the last 15 years or so from Biologos has been really unsubstantiated criticism. And that while again, it's hard to argue from the genomics for a historical Adam and Eve, you can't rule that out either. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and stop talking there, and then actually stop sharing and turn the floor over to you guys to ask some questions or to engage in some conversations.
I'd like to ask a question.
Hang on a second. So Dr. Rana, thank you so much for that presentation. It was great, and really did segue nicely from Ken's talk. We're going to go ahead and open it up for questions. We have questions both here in person and online. And so if you're online, just go ahead and raise your hand. There's a little button to push on Zoom that raises your hand. And we'll just kind of, instead of us all trying to talk at once, we'll go ahead and go around. So I'll start with Doug Kyle, who has his hand up. And Doug, after you, then I'll go to Paul Bell here in our office here. And then I see William. So Doug, you're first. I'm going to go ahead and unmute yourself too.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Doug.
Okay, great. Fuz, thank you for a wonderful presentation. That was very, 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 very professionally done, and really appreciate the work you put into it. I just recently had a chance to reread Who is Adam? I'm reading an earlier edition, but I recall, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the claim is made in the book that Neanderthals did not interbreed with humans. I guess the first question is, do I understand correctly? And the second question is, if that is true, how does that square with people who go out and get, their genetic, I forget what you call it, but they go out to 23andMe and they get their genome analyzed, and they find out that they're, I don't know, 10% Neanderthal or whatever it is, or more. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, well, in 2015, we wrote an updated edition to Who is Adam. And what we did in that updated edition is we left the original edition fully intact and just added a third section to the book. And the idea was, look, there's been a decade of scientific discoveries that has taken place. There's been some criticisms of our model. There's places where we obviously needed to expand our model. And so we did that in the update. But since we were presenting a creation model that we were then evaluating in light of the scientific evidence, we thought it was important to leave the original model with the original predictions intact. And so what we did in the updated edition is pointed out that while we predicted that there would not be any evidence or any interbreeding between humans and Neanderthals, that actually in the intervening 10 years, evidence has actually emerged that I think is reasonably compelling that interbreeding actually did take place. And so this would constitute in effect a failed prediction, forcing us to revise our creation model to essentially recognize that interbreeding took place between modern humans and other hominins. So if you get the updated edition, there's a whole chapter that gives you a thorough discussion of the evidence for interbreeding. And at the time Who Was Adam was written, there was no evidence for interbreeding. That evidence came initially 2012 or so, when we began to get sequences from the Neanderthal genome, high quality sequences from the Neanderthal genome. And the initial evidence was essentially statistical, where there just seemed to be a closer affinity between the Neanderthal genomes and the genomes of people from Asia and Europe than from Africa. And so the one way to explain that would be if there was interbreeding that took place when humans began to migrate around the world. Although there were other ways you could explain that data through incomplete lineage sorting and things like that. But since that time, the work has really increased in sophistication. And to me, there are two things that convinced me interbreeding took place. One is that there are these anatomically modern human remains that dated about 40,000 years. There's several that have been studied now, where we have been able to reconstruct significant portions of the genomes of those creatures, or those modern humans, these ancient anatomically modern humans. And they actually have Neanderthal signature sequences in them. Those sequences are at a higher percentage, which is what you would expect because they're closer to the time of interbreeding. And the Neanderthal sequences are much longer. They have a greater they have a greater continuity, I guess, which is exactly what you'd predict. So I don't know how you would explain that other than there was interbreeding. The other evidence that I think is really provocative and hard to, again, dismiss is that while most of us have about 1% to 2% Neanderthal DNA in our genomes, those 1% to 2% that we do possess are different sequence elements. And so from person to person, while we may have the same percentage of Neanderthal DNA in us, that percentage this precise sequence elements are different. In fact, in a human population, you can typically reconstruct about 40% of the Neanderthal genome just from the Neanderthal sequences in the human genome. And that suggests that there was probably multiple intergression events. I just recently did a Facebook live session that's housed on our YouTube channel, Reasons to Believe 1, where and it's the Facebook live session is recorded and archived there, where I talk about some recent work done on human Neanderthal interbreeding that was done by interrogating genomes from Icelanders. There was 27,000 genomes that were interrogated, and again, the researchers were able to construct about 40% of the Neanderthal genome. So it really does look like there was interbreeding that took place. Now, a couple things that are interesting, and that is that number one, it doesn't look like the hybrids that resulted were right on the cusp of being fertile. So we don't see any evidence for Neanderthal DNA in the Y chromosome, which means that Haldane's rule applies. And Haldane's rule is that when you have two species that interbreed, if you produce offspring and that offspring lacks fertility, it typically is the male that lacks the fertility, where the female actually is able to reproduce, but that female has to cross with someone from the parent, with a member of the parent population. And so it looks like, again, the hybrids that resulted, the males were either not viable or they weren't fertile, and the females were fertile, but they were just on the cusp of being fertile. And that if they did have hybrids, it would have been where they would have had to have reproduced with humans that would have had no Neanderthal contribution to their genomes at all. And there's also another observation, and that is there's regions of the human genome where there are no Neanderthal sequences in whatsoever. So the Neanderthal sequences are only found in certain portions of the human genome, that there are these Neanderthal deserts in the human genome. And it turns out that those Neanderthal deserts correspond with regions in the human genome that actually encode information that make us biologically distinct in terms of our craniofacial anatomy. So in other words, it looks as if, even though interbreeding took place, there was some kind of protective mechanism that was kicking in that was preventing Neanderthal DNA from fundamentally altering the humanness of the hybrids that resulted. So anyway, so the interbreeding did take place, and that is something that we didn't predict in our original version of the model, but that we since acknowledged and have accepted and are now looking to incorporate into our model. So
Great. Well, that certainly leads to a bunch of other questions that I won't ask, but Paul here has a question.
Hi, Fuz. I'm not a particularly scientific mind, but I'm just trying to struggle to understand this creation event. How would you respond to some of those who have suggested that God used existing hominids or Neanderthals and divinely infused them with this thing called the image of God and therefore changed them? Or how would you understand, a secondary question, exactly what happened in the creation event? I'm trying to understand this myself, and also how this intermixes with others' views.
hey, Paul, I think we went snorkeling in Alaska, didn't we? Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
Yeah,
We also had some nice dinners together, didn't we?
we sure did. Anyway, sorry about that. When I saw you, it's like, oh yeah, I remember. That brings back some fun times. Hey, yeah, great question. From my perspective, I think the way I read scripture, and I'm not unique in this, there's others that read it as well. It looks as if Adam and Eve, according to the biblical text, were de novo creations. So when I read, for example, the Genesis 2 account, the Hebrew verbs that are being used there to describe the creation of Adam and then subsequently the creation of Eve from Adam's side are verbs that are typically associated with God being directly and personally involved in that activity. It's the type of words that would be used for a potter shaping a pot of clay or something like that. That's what we see in Genesis 2, where the word used to describe Eve's creation, Banah, means that she was Adam rebuilt. And again, it implies an intimate involvement on the part of the creator and the object being created. Or in Genesis 1, we see, again, a similar kind of word, as well as the word bara being used, which means to originate something new that has never existed before. And so those words seem to imply, again, God creating in a direct personal way human beings. So I don't know that it leaves much room for God, breathing, the image of God or infusing the image of God into a hominin. Although I don't know that the text rules that out necessarily. I mean, I think the scientific data is actually consistent with that, right? Where you couldn't say that there was this hominin that God chose and then suddenly instantiated in that hominin the image of God capacity, right? And then suddenly you've got, this new creature, right? That appears, right? And that would be, but what would be required if from the scientific data for something like that to happen would be that creature would somehow have a very unusual skull anatomy. That would be a globular skull with a retracted face. And what we see is that, none of the hominins had that feature. So that would actually argue against, that particular model. I think it's a viable model, and I don't personally have a fundamental issue with that model as long as you are arguing that Adam and Eve were sole progenitors of humanity. To me, I think that is probably theologically much more critical than exactly how we get to that point. But that there really was an Adam and Eve that were the very first human beings that gave rise to the totality of humanity. And so how you get there, whether it's de novo creation or God taking a hominin and then doing something to that hominin to make it distinct, is as long as that hominin was Adam and there were none other like him, then I don't see why you couldn't adopt that particular approach, right?
Thank
I
you.
don't know if that helps you or not, but
Yeah, that's good.
I mean, when you talk about mechanistically, what did God do precisely when he created? I don't know honestly how to answer that question, other than to say it looks like God is intervening in a direct personal way, right? But that gives you a lot of latitude, which is, I think, actually, good news. I think one of the points that I'd like to make tonight that I made at the workshop is that we've got to move as evangelicals and conservative Christians away from kind of a territorial approach to science faith issues and adopt much more of a collaborative approach, where I think it's perfectly fine for people to say, this is my model, and I've got very strong reasons for holding this model. But instead of viewing people that hold opposing views or differing views, I should say, not opposing views, but differing views, as being somehow a threat, what we ought to do is view them as collaborators and look and have these things like we did with the workshop, where we begin to work together to try to come up with either a compromise model that everybody can sign off on, or if not, a collection of models that we all think are viable models. And so to me, I think there, within the traditional biblical view, there's a fair amount of latitude to propose, I think, viable models that don't violate kind of the what would be the critical features of a traditional biblical model. I think for that matter, the idea of William Lane Craig and even Ann Gager, I would argue, are still traditional models because they still are holding to the historicity of Adam and Eve being the sole progenitors of all humanity. It's just that they would place Adam and Eve in a different place than we would. That would be the fundamental difference between the three of us. So that can lead to some really robust conversations as to what do we precisely mean by the image of God? How do we probe it? What's the best marker? And there, Ann Gager, William Lane Craig, and I take differing perspectives. But I think that could actually be healthy if we then approach this with the spirit of having, again, a vigorous dialogue on this, but looking towards identifying common ground and helping each other to produce the best possible model we can. So that really is the spirit of what we were trying to do in the workshop, and really the spirit in which I would engage people tonight and then, in any other evening, who say, well, what about this idea? Or what about that idea? You know, I may not necessarily find that approach compelling, but you know, I think it's an approach that is worth entering into the dialogue as an option, right?
That's really refreshing to hear. I know it's a consistent message that I've heard from RTB all along. So I don't see it as something new, but it's wonderful to see it exemplified, because it's the way we need to carry on our dialogue with different approaches. So I want to respect your time, but we do have William Rogers has had his hand up for a long time. I wonder if you wouldn't mind taking just a few more questions here before we let you go.
Oh, of course, yeah. I'm happy to do that.
Great. So William, go ahead.
Okay, Dr. Rana, privileged to listen to you and get a chance to talk to you.
Thanks.
Got dozens of questions, but I'll try to scope it here. So I read both of your books, Who is Adam and the Who is Adam updated version, and really respected the fact that you could, you know, revise your model. But I really prefer the first model. And that has to do with Adam and Eve maybe having been created in the, you know, the 75,000 year range. I can admit I'm a little attached to that. So when I look at some of the things like the, I think it was called the principal component analysis chart that I've looked at before, there's the group 3 and the group 2. And of course, group 3 is 40,000 years ago. The group 2 was 100 to 130,000 years ago, but it's still a little bit outside. And it always makes me wonder if, you know, if they weren't quite humans yet. And the same with like the sand, the sand artwork that shows up 70,000 years ago. Maybe the sand people got that from humans or interbred with humans or something like that. And I'm wondering what's really the most compelling evidence that pushes the date, you know, prior to 70, 80,000 years ago.
Well, you know, I mean, to me, it's not a single archaeological find.
Yeah.
Right. It really is the fact that you see, you know, these you know, several cave sites in South Africa that are giving a consistent picture that clearly these were modern humans that were making this. You know, again, with the sand, there's no reason, you know, to think that they're anything other than, you know, anatomically and behaviorally modern humans. They're, you know, just like us, you know, because the sand are with us today. And so, you know, the fact that they're making art that's 72,000 years old isn't surprising. It's perfectly consistent. You know, though they're hunter-gatherers, they're still, you know, I think the image of God is there. That capacity for symbolism is clearly there. So, I mean, that seems to be where the data is, you know, and then the fact that you see kind of this confluence of different lines of evidence. I mean, there's a high degree of uncertainty in the dates. So it's not precise, but the fact that you see that kind of confluence from 3 separate lines of evidence is really pretty compelling. You know, yeah, and even with the, you know, with the, let me see if I can pull that back up here. It'd be worth, let me see, what did I do with the, here it is. Let me see if I can quickly find that. Okay, here we go. So, yeah, so there, I mean, there are 2 different principal component plots. I'm not quite sure what,
So group 2, I think you had as the 100,000.
The thing is, I mean, what they did is they put a box around group 2 because it was group 2.
Yeah.
But you really, I mean, to your point, you really are on the edge there, right? But I think you would be hard to argue that these data points are somehow outliers. This data point perhaps, but the rest of them, they look very much like outliers. And you also have to be careful too, because these specimens, you know, have undergone, I mean, you know, they're not pristine specimens, right?
Sure.
So when you're trying to parameterize fossil remains,
Mhm.
sometimes it's not the easiest thing to do. But this particular plot, I think, is much more compelling, where it does seem like you're seeing a much closer grouping. And again, you do seem to have, it looks like an outlier. I'm not sure which one that corresponds to here. So you know, to me, the way I would interpret this is, I think it'd be hard pressed to say group 2 was really fundamentally distinct from group 3. Again, it's not
Yeah.
really, when you do principal component analysis, you have to know what the principal components are actually telling you, you know, you know, the combination of variables that produce those principal components, what are they actually reflecting anatomically speaking? And I don't know off the top of my head what the principal components were actually telling us in terms
Yeah.
of skull anatomy. So I think, a lot of people don't like the date of 150,000 years because they feel like it's really hard to square that with the genealogies. And I get that, but the data is what the data is, right? And
Right. Yeah. And I get that there's the mark, there's the ochre markers, that kind of symbolism.
Yeah.
But it seems like there's a big gap between a little bit of symbolism and then the socio-cultural Big Bang, where you have bows and arrows in Africa and Asia 65,000 years ago. But, so it seems like something happened in that time frame. And for 50,000 years before that, it's.
Well, I mean, and there is a difference too between capacity and the technology that results from that capacity.
Yeah.
So, for example, even though we've put somebody on the moon, we're fundamentally no different than the humans that were alive at the time of Jesus. Right. Or, and by the same extension, we're fundamentally no different than the very first, I would argue, anatomically and behaviorally modern humans. It's just that there's not been the evolution of technology. And so you could argue that there is this evidence for artistic, because when you look at the cave art, for example, it's very clear that there are artistic techniques that are being consistently utilized. And I had the privilege of talking with an artist who actually had studied the cave art and was profoundly impressed, because he was saying that, the techniques that they were using, where they were varying line thickness, was really very sophisticated. That they were once they painted, they would etch the outside to create a three-dimensional effect. The use of pigments was consistent. They were doing things where these pieces of art were actually multi-sensory experiences, where they would actually depict the art in cave locations where the acoustics would reinforce what's being depicted. So, for example, where would be a depiction of a herd of bison, it would be in the part of the cave where if you made certain sounds, it would create the effect of a thundering herd. I mean, it's wow. And so this is what's going on with the sand art too. The rock art is that it's actually kind of an artistic acoustical. These are artistic acoustical creations where they're taking advantage of the acoustical properties of the rock formations to create these effects. That reinforce the art. So it's really sophisticated stuff that you're seeing even at in the sand art. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but
it is helpful. Yeah, definitely more to learn.
Well, I mean, I would prefer that there wasn't interbreeding between humans and Neanderthals. It would make my life so much easier. But what I find is, number one is we have to, the data is the data, whether we like it or not. But secondly, I think there's something to be gained were engaging non-believers of actually being willing to say, okay, this is what I thought, and I had good reasons for thinking that, and I don't think that anymore. This is what the data seems to be suggesting. So as long as, you know, th- that, you know, that actually is very winsome for non-believers. It
Yeah.
opens up dialogue. So
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
I feel your pain, man.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. Hey, we have one more question here for you before we let you go, if that's okay.
Sure.
Hey Fuzz, my name's Dave Mather. I've really enjoyed RTB through the past maybe 8 years or so. It's been very helpful for me. I actually did a geology degree when I was first went to school and was a Christian and came out with my faith intact and things. And I definitely came out with the idea that the Earth is certainly old and the universe is old, and that the data on the ground seem to easily comply with that. This issue that you brought up about who is Adam, this interbreeding. I posted a comment to you and Hugh Ross. This idea, it originally first troubled me because I thought, wow, it just seems to be wrong. But then you look at the scriptures and you see that actually there's bestiality that's discussed. So there's, human and animal interaction. And apparently in Genesis 6, there's some kind of demonic and human interaction. So the idea that something could viably come from these interactions is not necessarily unbiblical. For whatever reason, God allowed it. And so humanity then, even genetically, may bear the scars of sin, right? Different kinds of sin. But I guess for me, this issue that Adam was just potentially a Neanderthal or a hominid who was then turned into the image of God, that I just feel like, personally for me, that's a step too far. Simply from the thinking about who Christ was and what his mission was, and he's coming to redeem humanity. There's that verse that says there was the first Adam, and then Christ, the last Adam. So there's this sense that he really is a true originator. But when you were talking about in Genesis, there's these three verbs. It says God created bara, that was the sea monsters. And then God created, in the beginning, God created bara, the heavens and the earth. And then it says God created bara, man in his own image. And those three verbs are, for what Hugh Ross brings out, is those are kind of origin from nothing. So, you had this sociocultural Big Bang you talked about. There clearly was a universal Big Bang. There was a Big Bang apparently in Adam and Eve. There appears to be like a Big Bang with the Cambrian explosion. I don't know. I guess for me that my concern is if you start to move away from the uniqueness of Adam and Eve to being just essentially kind of like animals, it seems like their meaningfulness decreases a little bit. Does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it doesn't bother me that new information's coming out, but to me, what I would want to hold to in Scripture is those bara statements as God made. It does seem like, isn't that kind of the idea of progressive creation, that different life forms were put on the earth at different times to slowly build up? If that is the case, then there wouldn't necessarily need to be a modification of a different life form and just make a new life form. So if that's the case, you wouldn't necessarily need to modify, Neanderthals. You could just create a new something. But does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, that would be the view that I would hold, and that the shared features reflect, shared designs as opposed to continuity. And my only point was that, there are some people who feel more comfortable with the idea that God infused the image of God into a hominin, and that's how Adam was created. And I think there are ways you could adopt that view and still retain a historical Adam that would be the sole progenitor of all humanity. though that would not be my preference, and for the very reasons that you're pointing out. So there's just certain pieces of evidence that weigh differently for different people, and I think it's important that we respect that. And to me, if people are striving to produce a model that accommodates all the data, and are trying to take the scriptures seriously and interpret them carefully, I just don't have those are people that I feel like that are part of the solution, I guess, right, to helping the church get there.
That's what I've been trying to do for a long time, is piece together, okay, what's the big picture? There's all these different, new
Right.
information recently that comes in, and
Right.
but I do appreciate, the one thing I've learned from RTB is that you guys tend to be way more respectful than some of the other groups that are out there. And when you guys get in your discussions, you don't make a point of it personally trying to offend the other person or call them names or anything. You're just kind of doing a dialogue, and I think that in itself is a huge benefit for the overall discussion. So thank you. I appreciate all the work you've done.
So, William, you have one last brief parting question, right?
Okay, yes. I'll try to make it brief, and all the other questions have kind of percolated this. So on my blog, Ages of Joy, I'm exploring this this model because, like many of you, trying to figure out how this could have all fit together. And the model I explored there was the idea of Adam being like Christ, a virgin conception, as it were, the Son of God within the womb of a near anatomically modern human, then born as Adam, the Son of God. And then Eve in the same way, from the genetic material of Adam, in some fashion. So that's kind of how I reconcile it in my head, at least as something I'm exploring. And I'm wondering if that is a model that you've ever heard of, or is something that has obvious red flags.
I don't know that I've heard that precisely. It's an interesting idea. I'd have to think about it. I want to be a little reticent to comment off the cuff.
Okay.
But it's an interesting idea, and I mean, in a sense, it's kind of I don't know if I'd even say it's a variant of God taking a hominin and then kind of doing something. It's an interesting idea.
Yeah, because as we know from the interbreeding, even a female Neanderthal could potentially have given birth to a human male. God being the father of it, and right. more so a near anatomically modern human.
Interesting idea.
So.
All right. Well, it's almost 9 o'clock. We promised Fuz that we'd get him out of here at 8:30. So you've been very gracious to us. Yep. So thank you so much for sitting in and presenting and sparking such an interesting dialogue. One of the things that is a challenge for us looking into the work that you guys are doing there is that you're covering so many different interesting topics. I see somebody brought the latest climate change one. I'm like restraining myself to getting into this, but this will be our next series after we do a bunch more of these human origin ones. And then you mentioned something that's super intriguing, and maybe you could repeat it, that your next conference is going to be on the artificial intelligence and kind of the themes of human 2.0.
Yes. Yeah. Human exceptionalism.
Yeah.
So,
and when is that going to be? Is that going to be another live streamed event?
Yes, most like, I mean, what we did with the past workshop was, it was essentially, the whole thing was closed to the public and available only to invitees and our scholar community. And then afterwards, we didn't quite get the talks available publicly as quickly, but after we'd had the presentations and the panel discussions, we actually had a workshop time, and that was recorded, but that's not going to be made publicly available. But the presentations and the panel discussions are publicly available. So we'll probably do something similar. We haven't set a date yet. We're still kind of in preliminary discussion, phases for that, but
Well, we look forward to whatever of that is made public, because I have to say that the previous one, I think it was in February, about the historical atom, really sparked my interest in a deep way. So appreciate
Good.
that work.
good.
So let's go ahead and wrap up. I recognize we didn't say a quick word of prayer beforehand, so I'd like to close us out with a little prayer, if you don't mind. So, Father, we just are so grateful for how you've revealed yourself to us through your word and through your creation. Lord, we thank you for reasons to believe in the work that they're doing in trying to understand and interpret your revelation through nature, through the tools of science, and just help us to understand what you've revealed in your word ever more clearly, Lord. We thank you for that. Thank you for these people, and we especially thank you for Dr. Rana for spending this evening with us. We love you and praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Hi, everybody. If you can fill out that survey, that'll help us out really well. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Dr. Rana, appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, y'all.
Bye.